Snow fell on the highway like someone had spilled flour on an old film reel. The road was nearly empty. No headlights, no sounds, just the wind howling and the muffled crunch of tires on ice. Dan Merrick sat behind the wheel of his old SUV, staring into the darkness as if trying to see through it. He'd been driving for 8 hours straight. Not a single gas station, not a single person. Only trees, tall pines and spruces like silent guardians lining the road. In the back seat, his backpack full of camera gear shifted slightly with each bump. Dan was returning home from filming a documentary in the Siberian taiga. He was tired, physically, emotionally. Weeks of sleeping in tents, surrounded by wolves, owls, and biting cold. He captured nature, but somehow never felt part of it. Like watching life through the glass of his lens, always at a distance. He turned the heater up, the windshield fogged, and he wiped it clear with his sleeve. "Almost home," he muttered. That's when he saw movement on the roadside. He hit the brakes. The car skidded slightly, but stopped. The headlights lit up a shape, something dark, large, almost blending with the snow. A wolf. But something was wrong. It wasn't moving properly, twitching oddly, like it was trapped. Dan stepped out of the car. The cold hit him like a slap. He walked closer and saw it. A steel trap clamped tightly around the wolf's front leg. Blood had already dried. The snow beneath was stained dark red. The wolf breathed heavily, but didn't growl. It just stared at him. And in those eyes, there was no rage, just exhaustion and waiting. "Damn," Dan whispered. "Who the hell sets traps this deep out?" He knew it was dangerous. One bite, that's all it would take. But his hands were already moving. He pulled off his jacket, covered the wolf's head so it wouldn't see. Then he pulled out a multi-tool and slowly pried the rusty trap open. The wolf flinched, but didn't bite, just whimpered. When the trap released, the wolf gently pulled back its leg. Dan wrapped it with a torn piece of his sleeve. He left some food beside the animal, stood up, and walked back to the car. He didn't look back. The wolf, it just sat there and watched his back until the headlights vanished into the storm. When Dan got back in the car, his hands were shaking, not from the cold, from adrenaline. He sat there for a while, staring at the falling snow, trying to process what he had just done. He could have kept driving. Most people would have. It was the wild, not his responsibility. But the wolf's eyes, they haunted him. He started the engine and kept going. Within 30 minutes, the snowfall turned brutal, a full-on blizzard. Visibility dropped to nearly zero. Dan slowed down and eventually pulled off the road, deciding to sleep in the car for the night. He pulled out a sleeping bag, curled up inside, but sleep didn't come. The wolf was still there, behind his eyes. Not as a threat, not as an animal, but as something alive, looking through him. He thought, if I'd just driven past, I would have regretted it forever. That night, for the first time, Dan felt like he was part of nature, not just observing it. He remembered the way the multi-tool felt in his cold fingers, how the wolf flinched, how it could have bitten him, but didn't. That moment struck deep. The wolf had trusted him. By morning, Dan continued on his way. By midday, he arrived home, a small northern town where his mother greeted him with hugs and hot soup. He didn't mention the wolf, not because she wouldn't believe him, but because it was theirs, his and the wolf's, something sacred. He thought, maybe it was chance, maybe it was a sign, but from this day forward, I'm not just filming the wild, I'm in it. And he didn't know yet, that from that day on, the wolf would never be the same either. 2 months passed. The snow began to melt, but something inside Dan was only just beginning to thaw. He kept editing footage for his documentary, shots of predators in the taiga, their fight for survival, their fierce beauty and fragile existence. The visuals were stunning, but inside him, something scraped and rattled. He couldn't stop thinking about that wolf. How easy it had been. Hit the brakes, change a life, or drive past and let it end quietly. The film premiered. Reviews were glowing. It even won an award, Best Wildlife Cinematography. But Dan didn't celebrate. He sat through the ceremony, clapping politely through speeches, and felt hollow. He realized something. Filming wasn't enough anymore. He was tired of being just an observer. He started reading reports on predator population decline, poaching, habitat loss. His mind shifted from showing nature to protecting it. Within 6 months, he founded a small wildlife protection fund, starting with the very region where he had saved the wolf. The money didn't go toward camera gear or film campaigns. It went toward rangers, field medics, volunteers, and the rescue of injured animals. When people asked why he abandoned such a promising documentary career, he would only smile, because once he had looked into the eyes of a wild beast, and it had looked back. He didn't know how long he lay in the snow after the human freed him. The wind blew away the blood. The cold gnawed at his muscles. But the wolf was alive. His paw throbbed with pain. He couldn't stand, only crawl. Inch by inch, following the trail pressed into the snow. He dragged himself toward the trees, where the wind was weaker and the bushes thicker. It took hours to reach shelter. He howled in pain, but softly, so predators wouldn't come, or humans. The first night passed in a haze. The second was worse. His wound began to rot. He licked it clean as best he could, waited, hoped, and on the third night, a miracle. An old she-wolf from his former pack found him. She had caught his scent and returned. The pack had long moved on, but she brought him back. They accepted him. Not right away, but they did. At first, he was at the fringe, limping, eating last, sometimes pushed aside, but he did not give up. Weeks passed. The paw healed. A scar remained. The pain, too. But he ran again. Not as fast as before, but wiser. He watched. He learned. He began to lead hunts. At first, they failed. Then, they didn't. He knew where to wait, where to hide, how to read other animals. And most importantly, he never stepped into a trap again. He smelled metal beneath snow. He sensed danger before others. Soon, the others began to follow him. 2 years later, he became the alpha, and his pack became the most cautious, the most resilient in the region. They didn't fight over every bone. They fought, as if a piece of the human world had stayed within him. But above all, he remembered. He remembered the one who stopped, the one who let him go. And he never forgave those who set traps. 7 years had passed since that night in the forest. Everything had changed. Dan was now a well-known activist. His foundation had helped preserve dozens of square miles of protected land. He no longer just filmed the wild. He fought for it. In courtrooms, in protests, in tense standoffs with poachers. Often, he stood alone. One day, he got a call. Deep in the north, near the border of another region, volunteers had found new traps. The area was supposed to be safe, But in truth, lawlessness ruled there. Dan didn't hesitate. He packed his gear, a long-lens camera, a satellite phone, a notebook, and headed north. He knew the risk, but he believed if someone was setting traps again, he had to be the first to act. For 3 days he scouted the forest, placed motion cameras, marked suspicious areas. Human tracks were rare, but animals were avoiding certain paths. That was a sign, a bad one. On the 4th night, he heard a howl. Not nearby, but not far either. Deep, steady, a response to a call. Dan knew that kind of sound. It was an alpha, a leader. He didn't know whose, but a chill ran down his spine. The next day, he found it. A trap. New, clean, baited. And next to it, wolf tracks. Big ones. Fresh. They moved in a wide arc, as if the wolf had sensed the danger and avoided it. Dan crouched down beside them. He couldn't believe it. It was too precise. It felt like someone had left him a message. I'm still here. And I remember the smell of death. He snapped photos, sent coordinates to the team, but his mind was already somewhere else. What if it's him? A week had passed since Dan arrived in the region. He had already tracked down several traps, filmed an illegal poacher camp, and even argued with a local hunter. Nothing official, but the threats were real. Get out of here, filmmaker. We've got our own rules. But Dan didn't leave. He knew if he left, they'd come right back. He woke early, hiked deep into the woods with his camera, collected evidence. He barely ate, barely slept. What kept him going was a strange feeling that he wasn't alone. Sometimes he was sure he was being watched, not by a man, by something silent, fast, unseen. He'd notice movement in the underbrush, odd tracks in the snow, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on his back. On the 8th day, he heard a gunshot, one loud and sharp, like a whip through air. He ran toward the sound, branches slashing his arms, boots slipping in the snow. Within minutes, he found a body, a wounded deer, bullet barely grazing it. But nearby, something worse. 3 men in camo, rifles in hand. Dan raised his camera. Hey guys, filming for the Conservation Fund. Want to say anything for the viewers? One of them chuckled. Film all you want. Just delete it later. Got it? I can't. You're on protected land. This is a crime. The man stepped closer. So you think you're a hero, huh? He raised a hand, ready to grab Dan's camera, when suddenly a crack came from the bushes. They all froze. What was that? Bear? One muttered. But it wasn't a bear. Out of the brush stepped a massive gray wolf, scar running down his leg. He stood silent, still, as if he was reading each of them with his eyes. He didn't growl, didn't charge, but the air thickened with fear. One man stepped back, another lowered his rifle, and Dan just stood there, mouth open. He recognized him. It was the same wolf. They stood frozen, like a scene from a silent film. 3 men with rifles, 1 man with a camera, and 1 wolf with a scar on his leg and a past in his eyes. Time stopped. No one moved. Shoot it, one poacher whispered. It's just an animal. But the second man's hand trembled. He couldn't lift his gun. Something was wrong. The wolf wasn't wild, or rather, not just wild. He looked like a man, like someone who understood. Then everything exploded. The third man, the most nervous, fired into the air. A crack. Panic. The wounded deer bolted into the brush. One poacher stumbled. In that exact moment, the wolf leapt. He didn't attack. He distracted. He passed within inches of the first man, knocking him off balance. A short growl, sharp and commanding. A flash of movement, cracking branches. And he was gone. All three poachers scattered. One ran after the wolf. Another sprinted toward their truck. The third stood paralyzed, shaking, whispering. That wasn't a normal animal. Dan clutched his camera to his chest, breath ragged. He understood now. This wasn't a coincidence. The wolf remembered, and this time he had chosen a side. Dan didn't waste a second. He recorded the GPS location, memorized the men's faces, and followed his own trail back. Within the hour, he was at his tent, heart still pounding, brain still trying to catch up. That night, he didn't sleep. He edited footage. In one frame, the wolf, staring straight into the lens. He zoomed in. Same eyes, same scar. A debt returned, and the forest remembered. The morning after the encounter was silent, too silent. No gunshots, no footsteps, not even the wind. As if the forest itself had held its breath, waiting to see what Dan would do next. And Dan knew he had everything in his hands. Photos of the traps, footage of the poachers' faces, and the wolf, stepping between him and death. He returned to the city and immediately went live on his foundation's platform. The video was just 12 minutes long, but it wasn't just about poaching. It was about how the wild responds, if you learn to listen. We often think the wild doesn't understand us, but once I saved a wolf, and 7 years later, he saved me. Not out of debt, but to remind us, this world is alive, and it remembers. The video exploded online. Journalists called. Interviews followed. Environmentalists praised him. Even the police took interest. 2 of the poachers were arrested within 48 hours. The third, still on the run. Dan knew he would have never made it without the wolf. He returned to the forest. Walked the same path, back to where it all happened. He called, waited, searched. Silence. No tracks, no sound. Only at the top of a hill, beneath an old tree, he found a paw print. Large, deep, fresh. Just one. A goodbye. He smiled and walked away. The forest had returned the favor, and like always, it had vanished back into itself. A year had passed. Dan's video was still talked about, quoted, replayed. He'd been invited to give lectures, made a full documentary, even won an award. But none of that truly mattered to him. The real story remained in the forest. One spring morning, as the snow began to melt, he returned. No camera, no crew, just himself. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Mist rose from the ground. The forest felt different, and yet familiar. Ethereal, alive, real. He walked the same trails, climbed the same hill where he'd last seen the wolf's paw print. And then he froze. At the top stood 2 wolves. Young, strong. One had the same golden eyes. The other, smaller, but with the same proud posture. They stared at him, not as prey, not even as threat, but as someone remembered. One stepped closer. No growl, no snarl, just approached. Dan didn't move. The wind whispered through the trees. The wolf tilted its head slightly, then turned back and disappeared into the forest. They were gone, but it was enough. Dan understood. The wolf hadn't lived in vain. He had left behind family, strength, legacy. Dan returned to the city a changed man. He no longer sought fame. He launched a rewilding project to restore forests and protect predators, and his story became a legend, one told to a new generation. Several more years passed. Dan's project had grown, reforested lands, rescued animals, protected sanctuaries. But Dan himself began to step back, to speak less and listen more, as if he too was becoming part of the forest that once saved him. He built a small cabin at the edge of one of the rewilded zones. No electricity, no cell service, just silence, wind, a fire, and morning tea. And sometimes he saw them, from afar, the wolves, grown now, confident, leading their own pack. They didn't approach, and he didn't call. They just were, and that was enough. In his journal, he once wrote, "I thought I saved a wolf, but in truth, he saved me. He reminded me who I was, and the forest gave me home." Over time, trails formed near his cabin. People came to learn, to listen, to reconnect, not with the wolves, but with themselves, through the mirror of nature. And sometimes, when snow fell and evening shadows wrapped the land, he'd step out onto the porch and hear the howl. Soft, deep, a sign that all was right. And in that sound, there was no fear, only the ancient music of balance, where all living things are connected.